Welcome to A-Push. Okay, today is the day where the fecal matter really starts to hit the oscillating unit. So, without further ado, here are your basic objectives. Take a moment and process and copy them down if necessary. And let's talk about what happens when the British try to end salutary neglect, and what happens when people have expectations about how things are supposed to go, and then they don't go in that way. So, obviously, the problem that the British is facing is multiple fold. Here is the English lion dismembered by the budget and Native American related problems. So they have to do something about the fact that England is more or less going to go bankrupt. They tried the proclamation line, and that was not ideal. So we're going to see a couple of other ways that the British are going to try to raise revenue. So a lot of this stuff is going to fall under the auspices of the Revenue Act of 1762, which hopefully I don't have to explain to you what the goal of the Revenue Act is. The goal is, of course, cutting down significantly on smuggling and trying to actually raise the revenue that they should have been raising based on things like the Molasses Act. So this slide right here tells you the extent of the problem in the idea that, the Americans are paying about 1% or less than 1% of the taxes that they legally should be paying according to the taxes on the books. In order to do this, they start using a series of legal tools that exist in English law, but that have become incredibly controversial when used against the colonists. The first are writs of assistance. These are blank search warrants that allow British revenue authorities and customs officials to more or less go in and search whatever they want. They're handed out to these customs officers, and they just fill in the name of whoever they want to search, and then it's now legal to search your home, your ship, wherever you want. This, of course, is so outrageous the colonists that we put this in the Bill of Rights to make it illegal. But the British were able to use this in order to attempt to crack down on smuggling, because, as we mentioned before, smuggling was rampant. And so the British had every right to try to force the Americans back to legal avenues of trade. This, of course, outraged the colonists, and so we start getting the beginning of these protest pamphlets. The most famous of these, The Rights of the British Colonists by James Otis, who lays out the concept of taxation and representation, the idea that the colonists should have rights as British people, and that the fact that they are not represented in Parliament is tyranny. The Sugar Act of 1764 was an attempt to recoup some of those tariffs on sugar that weren't being paid. It was actually a tax cut, so they were trying to significantly decrease the tax on sugar, but increasing enforcement. The problem, of course, is that the colonists had been used to paying a bribe that was still lower than the lowered sugar tax. And so to the colonists, this felt like, one, a tax increase, and two, increasing pressure from the British, or increasing British tyranny and sort of seeing more and more imperial enforcement, which, of course, outraged the colonists. Then you've got the Currency Act, which prevented the colonies from printing their own currency, which, is logical, but at the same time, this rankled the independent-minded colonists and their representative assemblies, because in the end, the colonists tried to print their own currency in order to pay these taxes, and the British government said, no, you actually have to use actual currency. You can't print your own. But to the colonists, again, infringement upon their rights, et cetera, et cetera. Quartering Act is a famous one that I'm sure you're aware of. You're probably aware of the more famous Quartering Act in the 1770s. But this one was the idea that the cities have to house or pay for the housing of British soldiers. Usually it wasn't like there's a British soldier crashing on your couch. Usually it was more like you need to provide some sort of lodging for them or pay some money to help lodge these soldiers because they're there for your protection. But of course, to the colonists, it felt like an undue or a new tax on them. And colonists in general were somewhat irritated with the British soldiers who sort of who felt superior to the colonists, lorded over them, had the tendency to drink and gamble and seduce the virtue of local maidens. And so the tension between the British soldiers and the colonists were simply growing. The Quartering Act led to one of the first major showdowns between a colonial government and the British. New York refused to pay for the quartering of soldiers, and so Parliament closed their assembly. And so this is one of the first examples of England getting mad at the colonists for not following along with their whole procedure, their whole proposal. And instead, the colonists, and then they closed down colonial assembly. This closing of colonial assemblies led further credence to the idea of we need representation or else, we cannot be taxed. The event that most represented both the British government's attempt to raise money and colonial resistance to new British policies was, of course, the Stamp Act. Hopefully, you're familiar with the Stamp Act. It was a tax on paper that most subjects of the British Empire paid. In England, the Stamp Act was, of course, a regular thing, but American colonists had never had to pay it before. So this new tax on paper meant that any contract, any deed, any will or lawsuit or newspaper had to have one of these stamps on it. The stamp would cost a cent, and then the British government would take that and use that to help pay for the troops that were stationed in the Americas. The colonists, of course, freaked out because it's a new tax. They hadn't had to pay it before. And especially lawyers, merchants, and newspapermen would be paying a majority of this tax. And so they used all of their rhetorical skill. Here you can see an anti-Stamp Act newspaper article. So they used all of their rhetorical skill to try to turn people against the Stamp Act. Here is some anti-Stamp Act commemorative pottery. So when you're serving yourself tea, you can remind yourself how much you hate the Stamp Act. And you started in the South to start hearing colonial assemblies railing against British tyranny. Patrick Henry was one of the strongest voices in the House of Burgesses, famously threatening to assassinate King George. That was part of the documents that you read today. So the House of Burgesses dissolved by the governor, and now you've got your second colonial assembly that has been forbidden from meeting, although this slide notes that they continued meeting just in secret. In Boston, opposition to the Stamp Act became violent, and they started some merchants and lawyers in Boston, most famously Samuel Adams and John Hancock were two of the largest of the ringleaders of this group. They organized groups called the Sons of Liberty to threaten stamp collectors. And so this is a meeting where they're hanging a stamp collector in effigy, basically saying, if you take a job enforcing this law, we can't guarantee that we're not going to just hang you. And so in Boston, the Stamp Act was not enforced because it turned out it was very difficult for them to find people to be stamp collectors for some reason. The mob, after hanging stamp collectors in effigy, then went to the house of someone who had said that they would be a stamp collector and burned it to the ground. And then just for good measure, also went to the hated British Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house and burned that to the ground as well. So in Virginia, they gave impassioned speeches, and in Boston, they burned the governor's house to the ground. All of this. Oh, and here's Thomas Hutchinson fleeing from the mob. The Stamp Act hadn't even gone into effect yet, but the colonies started to band together in order to organize the resistance, most famously at the Stamp Act Congress. 9 of the 13 colonies sent representatives in order to try to organize boycotts and just centralize opposition to the Stamp Act. And so the Stamp Act Congress has the distinction of being the first mass gathering of all the colonies to fight back against what they saw as British overreach. Stamp Act Congress drafted a resolution to the king that articulated the idea that only local assemblies where people had representation could tax. And the Stamp Act Congress organized committees of correspondence, which operated in the major cities here as somewhat shadow governments, where the elites would send representatives there, and then they would come up with policy or organize boycotts or enforce boycotts or basically spread and coordinate their response. And so it created, for the first time, a sense of unity amongst the different cities and amongst the different colonies. Eventually, the British government decided to repeal the Stamp Act under all this pressure, and so the Stamp Act never actually went into effect. So the colonists won this round, sort of, except the whole point of the Stamp Act was to raise revenue for these troops, and now there's no revenue. England passed the Declaratory Act after repealing the Stamp Act, which more or less said that they were repealing the Stamp Act because they chose to repeal the Stamp Act, not because the Stamp Act was illegal, and they reaffirmed their right to tax the colonies however they so chose. And so this is the first wave of radicalism and the first attempt by the British government to exert more power over the colonies, and for the most part, it's been somewhat contentious. The Stamp Act utterly failed, and the colonies are more united than ever. So here are your main bullet points for the end of salutary neglect. Take a moment and make sure you can answer these in a somewhat substantive manner.